It was the kind of cold London morning that made everything feel heavier, your coat, your breath, your memories. David Beckham didn't even remember how he got from his apartment in Holland Park to the small chapel in Islington. One moment he had been staring at a strange text message on his phone, and the next, he was standing in front of a wooden door with a brass handle, hearing the faint echo of a hymn drifting from inside. The message had arrived at 5:42 a.m. from an unknown number. Arthur Walsh passed away. The funeral is tomorrow at 9 a.m. Chapel of St. Adelaide. He said, if Beckham doesn't come, then his entire life would have been a failure. David froze when he read it. Arthur Walsh? Who the hell is Arthur Walsh? He whispered to himself. But something in the tone, something in the desperation of that final sentence, pulled him in like an invisible hand wrapping around his chest. Which is why, even though none of it made sense, he found himself here. When he pushed open the chapel door, warm sunlight hit his face first, streaming through stained glass windows in colors that felt too vibrant for a funeral. The second thing he felt was the silence, thick, heavy, almost suffocating. There were only about 7 people inside. 7 strangers. And yet every single one of them turned to look at him the moment he stepped inside, as if they had been waiting for him. Only one person stepped forward. A woman in her 70s. Gray hair tied neatly in a bun. Eyes swollen from crying. She wore a dark navy coat and clutched an old rosary in one hand. She looked at David the way someone looks at a long-lost relative finally returning home. You came, she whispered. David blinked, confused. Excuse me, do we know each other? The woman pressed her lips together, swallowing emotion before answering. My name is Eleanor. I was Arthur's closest friend, for more than 30 years. David nodded politely. But the confusion on his face was impossible to hide. I'm sorry for your loss, he said. But I'm not sure why I'm. Eleanor didn't let him finish. She stepped closer, lowering her voice until only he could hear. He waited for you for 28 years. The sentence hit him like an unexpected gust of wind. David frowned. Waited for me? I don't understand. I didn't know him. Eleanor's eyes glistened. That, she whispered, is the tragedy. Before he could process her words, she reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. Yellowed. The edges slightly curled. Across the front were handwritten words. Only open if he comes. David hesitated. His fingers hovered over the envelope, trembling slightly. He hadn't even seen the coffin yet, hadn't even seen Arthur. But somehow, whatever was inside this envelope already felt too heavy to carry. You should read it after, Eleanor said gently. First, say goodbye. She gestured toward the front of the chapel. And that was when David finally saw him. A simple wooden coffin. No flowers except a small white lily placed on top. No photographs except for one framed picture leaning beside it. David walked closer and froze, because the face in the photograph, the face of Arthur Walsh, was strangely familiar. Not in the way you recognize a celebrity or a well-known public figure, but in a much deeper, unsettling way. Like a face that had appeared on the edges of old memories. On the periphery of childhood moments he never fully understood. A face that didn't belong to a stranger, but to someone whose absence had shaped his entire life. David's breathing grew shallow. He didn't know this man. And yet, somehow, his heart reacted before his mind could. He stepped even closer. Arthur was black, maybe in his late 50s or early 60s when the photograph had been taken. Kind eyes. Gentle smile. The kind of man who looked like he had lived through more storms than most people could survive, and still carried warmth. David felt a sudden sting behind his eyes. What the hell was going on? He turned back to Eleanor. You said he waited for me? David asked, voice shaking. Eleanor nodded. For as long as I've known him, and much longer than that. But why? David croaked. Why me? Eleanor took a deep breath. Open the letter, she said softly. It's time. David swallowed hard, then looked down at the envelope in his hand. His fingers tore through the paper slowly, almost ritualistically. Inside was a folded note, handwritten, shaky but deliberate. He unfolded it, and the first line shattered something inside him. My son. David's heart stopped. He felt the entire world tilt sideways. The words blurred for a moment as his eyes filled with tears. His hands trembled uncontrollably. He blinked hard and forced himself to continue reading. My son, if you are reading this, it means I am gone. And it also means you finally know. Know that I have been there, in the shadows, your whole life. David stumbled backward. The letter nearly slipped from his hand. No, this couldn't be real. He felt nauseous. His head spun. His father had died when he was young. His mother had told him that story countless times. And he believed her. Why wouldn't he? Arthur continued. I never had the right to call myself your father. Your mother asked me to stay away. And she had her reasons, many reasons. All painful, all valid, all rooted in fear. David's chest tightened painfully. His mother, his childhood, the missing pieces of everything. It suddenly felt like someone had taken the puzzle of his life and turned it upside down. He gripped the letter harder. But I stayed close in the only way I was allowed. I watched you grow. I watched you chase that ball in the back garden. I watched you fall and pick yourself up. I watched you become a man. Always from a distance. Always unseen. A tear dropped onto the paper. David clenched his jaw, holding back a sob. Images began to flash through his mind. Memories of being a small boy kicking a football against the wall. Memories of someone leaving an orange at the doorstep. Memories of a stranger fixing the broken fence without ever asking for anything. Memories of a warm presence he couldn't explain. He had always assumed it was a kind neighbor. He had never known it was him. Arthur. His father. The man in the coffin. The man he had never once spoken to. Not knowingly. David forced himself to finish the letter. I am sorry I couldn't be who I wanted to be for you. But if you remember anything of me, remember this. I never stopped loving you. Even from the shadows. Arthur Walsh. By the time he reached the last sentence, David was no longer standing tall. He sank onto the nearest wooden bench, elbows on his knees, hands covering his face. His entire body shook as silent tears fell freely. There was no point holding them back. The grief was too big, and the guilt was bigger. He whispered into his palms. I didn't know. God, I didn't know. For a long moment he stayed like that, just breathing, just trying to survive the tidal wave inside him. When he finally lifted his head, Eleanor was sitting beside him. He never blamed you, she said quietly. Not once in his life. David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He was my father, he whispered. And I never even said hello. Eleanor placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. But he saw you. Every success, every heartbreak, every goal, every moment you shone, he shone with you. David looked up at the coffin again. The man who had stood in the shadows of his life was gone. Forever. But the truth had just been born. David exhaled shakily. Why now? He asked softly. Why did he wait until his death to tell me? Eleanor's eyes softened. Because he didn't want to disrupt your life, she said. And because he wanted you to know only when you were strong enough to carry the truth without letting it destroy you. David swallowed hard. Strong? He whispered. I feel anything but strong. Eleanor smiled through her sadness. That means you're human, dear. Silence settled between them. A tender, painful silence. Finally, David stood up. He walked toward the coffin. He placed a hand gently on the wooden surface. And voice breaking, he whispered, I'm here, Dad. I'm sorry I'm late. And with those words, the chapter of his old life closed, quietly, painfully, and a new one began, forged from truth, regret, and the kind of love that survives even in silence. The rain had already started by the time David left the chapel, a fine gray curtain that made London look even more tired than usual. He stood on the pavement for a moment, the letter from Arthur still in his hand, as if his feet had forgotten how to move. Cars passed slowly, tires hissing on wet tarmac, people hurried by under umbrellas, and the world, absurdly, carried on as if nothing in it had just shifted. For David, everything had shifted. He walked to his car almost on autopilot, slid into the driver's seat and just sat there, engine off, forehead resting against the steering wheel. The word son kept circling in his head like a stubborn echo. My son, my son, my son. He thought of his own children then, of how fiercely he loved them, and the idea of loving them only from a distance, watching them grow through gaps in a fence or from the back row of a stand, hit him like a physical blow. He gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. After a while, when the windows had begun to fog with his breath, he forced himself upright and started the engine. He needed to go somewhere that still made sense. Somewhere that belonged to the time before the truth. Without quite deciding, he found himself driving east, away from the expensive postcodes and glass buildings, towards Leytonstone. Towards the terraced house where he'd grown up. The closer he got, the quieter he became. Familiar street names slid past the windscreen. Grove Green Road, Harrowdean, the little parade of shops that used to feel like the whole world when he was 10. Some had changed. A kebab shop where the old newsagent had been, a nail bar where there'd once been a bakery, but the bones of the place were the same. He turned into the road where his childhood house still stood. Time had peeled some of the paint from the doors and swapped a few cars for newer models, but the rhythm of the houses, brick, window, small front garden, repeats, was exactly as he remembered. He slowed in front of number 32, the red brick terrace with the slightly crooked gate. His parents had sold it years ago, but after his mother died he had quietly bought it back from the couple living there. He hadn't really been able to explain why, even to Victoria. "Memories," he'd said, shrugging. "Some things I just don't want to lose." Since then, it had mostly stood empty, used occasionally when he wanted privacy or needed to hide from the world. Today it felt like a place built specifically for this moment. He unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air had the faint mustiness of somewhere that had been closed too long, but beneath it was another layer, a ghost of washing powder, roast dinners, cheap perfume. His mother. The hallway was narrow and dim, the wallpaper the same pattern his mum had insisted on, tiny flowers marching in vertical lines. He ran his fingers along the banister as he walked through to the living room. The furniture he'd put in there was modern, neutral, too clean to belong properly to the space. It looked like a showroom. The room felt incomplete, like a stage without actors. He sat on the edge of the sofa and stared at the fireplace. On the mantelpiece sat the only things that really belonged to his past. A few framed photographs of him as a boy in football kits too big for his skinny frame, his parents younger and smiling, his mum's handwriting on a faded birthday card propped behind the frames. He got up and picked up one of the photos. His mum stood in the back garden, arms folded, trying to look stern but failing because she was smiling too widely. He was in the foreground, maybe 7 or 8, hair a mess, one sock pulled halfway down his shin, grinning at the camera with a ball tucked under his arm. There was a blur at the edge of the frame, a shadow behind the fence. He had never really noticed it before. Now the hair on the back of his neck stood up. He brought the photo closer, squinting. The blur wasn't just shadow. It was a figure, half caught, as if turning away, darker skin, the suggestion of a cap, shoulders hunched slightly. "Arthur," he murmured, the name tasting unfamiliar and familiar all at once. The room felt suddenly smaller. He put the photo down carefully and turned towards the stairs. There was one place in the house where the past still lived almost untouched, the loft. When his mum died, he hadn't had the heart to clear it. He'd promised himself he would one day. Today apparently was that day. The ladder creaked under his weight as he climbed up into the loft. Dust motes danced in the thin beam of light that came from the small skylight. The air was dry and thick with the smell of old paper and cardboard. Boxes were stacked everywhere, some with his dad's careful handwriting on them, Zmaz decorations, school books, Dave's football stuff. And near the back, one box he recognized instantly, his mum's. No label. Just a battered floral pattern and a piece of tape that had clearly been reused more than once. He knelt in front of it, suddenly nervous. The tape pulled away with a dry whisper, and the lid opened to reveal a mess of papers, envelopes, small notebooks, and a couple of jewelry boxes. On top was a folded scarf that still smelled faintly of her perfume. He pressed it to his face, eyes closing for a moment. "Hi, Mum," he whispered. I think we need to talk." He set the scarf aside and began to sort through the contents. At first it was ordinary stuff. Old letters from relatives, recipes torn from magazines, church notices, birthday cards. Then, caught between a stack of gas bills and a booklet from the local school, he saw an envelope with his name on it. "Not David. To my son when he's ready to ask." The handwriting was his mother's. A little shaky but unmistakable. His throat tightened. He sat back on his heels and stared at it for a long time, feeling like a boy again, like he was about to open his exam results or a report he wasn't sure he wanted to see. Finally, he tore it open. The letter inside was written on lined paper, the kind from cheap notepads. His mum's familiar loops and slants ran all the way down to the bottom of the page. "My Dave, if you're reading this, it means you're finally ready to ask the questions I never wanted you to have to ask. I don't know how old you are as you read this. Maybe you're 20, maybe 40, maybe older, but I know you. I know one day you'll look in the mirror and feel that something is missing and you'll come digging. That's why I wrote this instead of saying it to your face. Because I'm a coward." David's eyes stung. He shook his head. "No you weren't, Mum," he muttered. Then he kept reading. "You've always known your dad is Ted. He loved you. He really did. He worked double shifts and fixed everything himself and shouted at the telly when United were losing. He taught you how to kick a ball straight and how to shake a man's hand properly. He wasn't perfect, but he tried. And he was there. That counts for a lot in this world. But he wasn't the first man I loved. David swallowed. Before Ted there was Arthur. He was nothing like the men my parents approved of. He was quiet when others were loud. He listened when others talked. He was kind. The kind that doesn't make a fuss about being kind. He made me laugh when I was working 2 jobs and thought my feet would fall off. He walked me home when the late shifts finished and never once asked to come in if I said no. He was my friend before he was anything else. And he was black in a time and on a street where people still whispered about that behind curtains. David could almost hear her voice as he read, that mixture of stubbornness and apology she used when admitting something she knew would raise eyebrows. When I found out I was pregnant with you, I panicked. Your Nan said Arthur would never be able to provide. Neighbors made comments. People we thought were friends suddenly weren't. Arthur wanted to do the right thing. He wanted to stay. He wanted to marry me. He stood right in front of me, hands shaking, and said he wanted to be your dad. And I looked at this man I loved and I saw how the world already treated him, and I imagined how it would treat you. A mixed-race boy in a street that could barely tolerate anyone who supported the wrong football club. The way they would talk. The way they would treat you at school. The way they would look at us in the shops. I was scared, David. I was so scared. Tears began to fall freely now, spotting the paper. So I did what scared people often do. I made a decision that hurt the person I loved, and I told myself it was for the child. I told Arthur that I couldn't do it. I told him to go. I told him that if he really loved you, he would stay away and let me build a life for you that wouldn't be a battle from the first breath. And the worst part? He agreed. He cried and he agreed. He said he'd rather you grew up hating a nameless absence than resenting a father you watched being humiliated every day. I never forgave myself for that. But I couldn't bring myself to change it either. Because then you came along. And you were so small and so perfect, and I was so tired, and the world felt even harsher than before. So I kept the secret. David wiped his face with the back of his hand, but the tears kept coming. When you were little, you asked about your dad sometimes. I told you the story I'd built for us, that he died when you were young. Ted came into our lives later, and he loved you like his own, and you loved him back, and I let myself believe that was enough. But Arthur never really left. He lived 2 streets away for years. He'd bump into us at the shops. He'd stand at the end of the road when you played football in the park. You once asked me who the man was who always seemed to be there. I told you he was just a neighbor. And then, when you got older and started to be noticed, he slipped further back. He told me he didn't want to distract you, that he didn't want to confuse you. We fought about it. We cried about it. But we never changed it. David could picture it so vividly. His mom and Arthur arguing in a cramped kitchen, voices low but words sharp, all for the sake of a boy playing with a ball in the garden, blissfully unaware. If you're angry with me, you have every right to be. I lied to you. I chose fear over truth. I let a good man become a ghost in your life. I'm not writing this to ask for forgiveness. I'm writing it because I can feel time getting shorter, and I don't want to take all of this with me. You deserve to know where you come from. You deserve to know that there was a man who loved you long before the world learned your name. His name is Arthur Walsh. If he is still alive when you read this, go to him. If he is not, then find a way to do for someone else what he never got to do for you. That's the only thing that will make any of this hurt mean something. With all my love, Mom. By the time he reached the end, David was shaking. He laid the letter gently back in the box, then pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes until the world blurred into nothing. Anger, grief, understanding, regret, they all crashed together inside him, indistinguishable. He wasn't just crying for Arthur now. He was crying for his mother, for Ted, for the scared young woman in the letter, and the frightened man who agreed to disappear for a child's sake. He was crying for the boy he'd been, who had sensed a missing piece in his life but never been able to name it. How the hell was any of this fair? He whispered into the empty loft. No one answered. The only sound was his own ragged breathing. After a long time, he wiped his face and took a deep breath. There was more in the box. He knew he couldn't leave it untouched now. The truth was out. It made no sense to keep it half exposed. He found an old pocket diary of his mom's, one of those cheap ones given out by local shops. The pages were filled with ordinary things: dentist 4 p.m., Morrison's, big shop, Dave's match, away. But in between the mundane notes were smaller entries, squeezed into the margins. Arthur at the park again. Told him to keep his distance. Hated myself all day. Dave fell, scraped his knee. Reached out for me first. Thank God. Arthur was watching. His face. Arthur says he'll move closer to the station so he doesn't accidentally see us so much. Broke my heart. The words blurred again. David closed the diary and sat perfectly still for a few moments, listening to the creaks of the house. He suddenly remembered a day from his childhood, one he hadn't thought about for years. He'd been about 9 playing football in the street. A couple of older boys had started teasing him about not having a proper dad, mimicking his accent, calling him names. He tried to laugh it off, then ended up getting into a scrap. When he came home with a split lip, his mum had gone quiet, pressing a tea towel to his mouth, eyes darker than he'd ever seen them. Later that evening, he'd opened the front door a crack and seen her outside, talking to a man at the gate. He'd recognized him as the neighbor, who always seemed to be around. Her hands were flying, her voice low but sharp. The man had looked devastated. It was Arthur, he realized now. It had always been Arthur. David let out a long breath, as if he could exhale the years of half-remembered confusion. A vibration in his pocket made him jump. He pulled out his phone and saw a message from a number he now knew was Eleanor's. "Are you all right? If you want to know more about him, come by. He left something for you here as well." For a moment, David stared at the message. Part of him wanted to crawl into bed, pull the covers over his head and pretend none of this had happened. But another part, the same stubborn part that had taken thousands of free kicks until they were perfect, knew that running away wasn't an option. He climbed down from the loft, locked the house behind him and drove back across the city, the rain now only a drizzle, as if the sky itself were exhausted from crying. Eleanor lived in a small terraced house on a quieter street, the kind with hanging baskets outside and net curtains you could never quite see through. She opened the door before he reached the step, as if she'd been standing just behind it, listening for his footsteps. "You look tired," she said softly. "I feel older," he replied, trying to smile but failing. She ushered him into a cozy living room that smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Family photos lined the mantelpiece. Children, grandchildren, Arthur in the middle of them all at some long-ago Christmas, wearing a ridiculous paper crown and grinning. David's chest tightened at the sight. "Sit, love," Eleanor said, gesturing to the sofa. "Tea." "Always," he said, "because some habits never left you no matter how broken you felt." She disappeared into the kitchen, clinking cups and kettle, and returned a few minutes later with 2 mugs. She placed his on the coffee table, then sat opposite him, watching his face. "You saw your mother's letter?" she asked. He nodded. "Then you know more than I ever thought you would." She sighed. "She loved you, you know, fiercely. Everything she did was messy, but it was love." "I know," he said quietly. "I'm angry, but I know." Eleanor nodded slowly, relief flickering across her features. "Arthur never blamed her," she added. "He blamed himself more. Said if he'd been stronger, richer, more respectable, she wouldn't have felt she had to choose." David looked up sharply. "She did choose though, didn't she? She chose a story instead of the truth." Eleanor didn't flinch. "Yes, she did." The honesty startled him, but it also made him trust her more. "You said he left something else for me," he said. She reached for a wooden box on the sideboard. It was small, polished smooth with age, the lid slightly scratched. She placed it gently in his hands. "He called this his silly little hope," she told him. "Said it was for the day when he was finally allowed to exist in your life. He never got that day. But you have this." David opened the lid. Inside were photographs, dozens of them bundled together with an elastic band. His breath caught as he lifted them out. There he was, as a toddler in a pram, as a boy with scraped knees, as a teenager with too long hair and too much determination in his eyes. But these weren't the polished family photos from the mantelpiece at home. These were taken from a distance, over a fence, across a street, from the back rows of a stadium. In one, he was celebrating a goal on a muddy pitch in East London, teammates swarming him. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was Arthur, half obscured by a post, hands cupped around his mouth as he shouted something that never reached the camera. In another, teenage David walked home in his school uniform, bag slung low. Arthur stood under a tree on the opposite side of the road, pretending to read a newspaper, eyes clearly on the boy. Each picture was a fragment of a secret life, a record of a father loving his son without being allowed to say the word. At the bottom of the stack, there was a single photo different from the rest. It was old, edges curled, colors slightly faded. It showed his mother and Arthur sitting on a park bench, younger, laughing at something out of frame. Between them, in a pushchair, was David, maybe a year old, reaching out with both hands, face lit up. Arthur's gaze in the photo wasn't on the camera, was on the baby. The look in his eyes was so open, so overflowing with affection, that David had to look away. He felt like an intruder, stepping into moments he was technically part of but emotionally a stranger to. "There's more," Eleanor said gently. "Underneath." He lifted the false bottom of the box. Beneath it lay a thin notebook, its cover frayed. He opened it and saw Arthur's handwriting, more careful than in the letter, as if these words had been crafted over years. Day you signed for United. Watched the news alone in the flat. Cried like a baby. Bought a cheap bottle of champagne and toasted the telly. Day of your first cap for England. Went to the pub down the road. Told the barman you were my boy. He laughed. I laughed too. But it was true. Day the papers tore you apart after '98. Wanted to stand outside your house with a sign that said, "Leave my kid alone." Instead I stood at the end of the street and prayed you wouldn't break. David closed the notebook, overwhelmed. You asked why he waited for you, Eleanor said quietly. He didn't. He walked with you the whole way. You just didn't see his footsteps. Silence settled between them, this time gentler, like a blanket rather than a weight. After a while, David cleared his throat. Why the message? He asked. Why that line about his life being a failure if I didn't come? Eleanor leaned back, looking at the photo of Arthur on her mantelpiece. He didn't mean it literally, she said. He'd found peace in small things. Coaching kids at the community center. Helping neighbors. Drinking terrible tea with me and complaining about his knees. She smiled faintly. But there was a part of him, a small, loud part, that needed to be seen by you at least once. Not from the back of a crowd. Not through a fence. Just seen. And now he never will be, David said, voice cracking. Eleanor looked at him steadily. Oh, he sees you, she said. Just not from where we're used to. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, almost a sob. They sat together like that for what felt like a long time, two people bound by their love for a man who had spent most of his life in the spaces between. Eventually, Eleanor spoke again. There's one last thing, she said. He made me promise to tell you if you ever came. David tensed slightly. Tell me what? She hesitated, then continued. He used to run a little football group up in Manchester. Community place. Nothing fancy, concrete pitch, a leaky roof, too many kids and not enough balls. He loved it there. Said those boys reminded him of you. Same hunger in their eyes. Same way of hanging everything on a game of five aside. She sighed. Funding got cut. Place started falling apart. He tried to keep it going, but his health, well, you know how that story goes. He always said, if I'd had the chance, I would have built something properly for them. A real academy. A safe place. Something that lasted. She looked him straight in the eye. His body gave up before his hope did. David felt something stir inside him then. A shift. A flicker of purpose in the middle of the grief. Is it still there? He asked. The center? More or less, she replied. Run down. Half closed. But the building's still standing. Some of the lads still kick a ball there at weekends. Why? He stared down at the notebook in his hand, at all the years Arthur had spent loving him from afar, and something clicked. He couldn't give the man a past where they had been father and son in the ordinary way. Those years were gone. But the future? That was still unwritten. I think, David said slowly, feeling the certainty grow as he spoke, it's time somebody finished what he started. Eleanor watched him, eyes soft but sharp. Then go and see it, she said. See where his heart lived when he wasn't standing at the end of your street. You might find more of him there than anywhere else. David nodded, fingers closing around the box, the notebook, the weight of a legacy he'd never expected to inherit. When he stepped back out into the cool afternoon, the rain had stopped. The pavement was still wet, reflecting the sky in broken patches of gray and blue. He took a deep breath, the air smelling faintly of damp stone and possibility. For the first time since reading Arthur's letter, he felt the tiniest thread of direction tugging at him. Not back towards the past, but forward. Towards a worn-out community center in Manchester. Towards a group of kids who didn't yet know someone was about to show up on their pitch. Carrying the love of a father who had never had the chance to step fully into the light. The motorway stretched endlessly ahead, a gray ribbon cutting through the rolling fields and low stone walls of northern England. David Beckham had driven this route countless times in his youth. Away games in Manchester, youth tournaments scattered across the region, early morning drives with his dad on freezing Saturdays. But today the road felt unfamiliar, as though it belonged to someone else's memories. Maybe, in a strange way, it did. The box from Eleanor sat on the passenger seat, the photographs and notebook carefully rewrapped in the scarf that had once belonged to his mother. Every time the car hit a bump, the box shifted slightly, and David instinctively reached out to steady it, like a parent steadying a sleeping child in the back seat. It wasn't just a box anymore. It was a life. A presence. a father he never truly had. He kept replaying fragments of Arthur's diary in his mind. I told the barman he was my boy. I prayed he wouldn't break. I watched him from the back row. Love should have been loud. But for Arthur, love had been silent. As he approached Manchester, the skies thickened into heavier gray, the kind that threatened rain without committing. Rows of terraced houses appeared, brownish red brick chimneys leaning slightly, satellite dishes jutting out like metallic scars. Clotheslines hung across small back gardens, football posts improvised from bins or old crates. Kids still played in the streets here. Kids who chased dreams with the same reckless hope he once had. And somewhere among these streets was the place where Arthur had poured his heart. The community center he had built with more hope than resources, more faith than support. David turned down a narrowing road lined with old warehouses and a few small shops fighting to stay alive. The sat-nav announced, "Your destination is ahead on the left." But he didn't need the voice. He knew he'd found it even before reading the faded sign. Reston Community Football House. Or what was left of it. The building sat sagging between two abandoned units. The once bright mural of smiling children was now cracked, the colors bleached by rain and years. A shutter on one window hung crooked, a casualty of age or vandalism. The double front doors were still blue, though the paint peeled in long strips like old wallpaper. David parked the car and stepped out. For a moment he simply stood there, letting the weight of the place settle into him. This was where Arthur had loved strangers' children in place of the son he could never claim. David approached the entrance, running his hand slowly along the worn brickwork. The door creaked loudly when he pushed it open, a long complaint that echoed through the empty corridor. Dust motes hung thick in the beam of light from the doorway. Inside smelled of damp concrete, old rubber soles, forgotten football kits. But beneath that, something else. A faint whisper of community, of laughter, of life that once pulsed in these walls. He took a few steps inside. His footsteps sounded too loud. "Hello," he called softly, unsure why he spoke. Habit maybe. Or reverence. His voice faded into the stillness. He walked further down the corridor until he reached a door marked Pitch Hall. The sign was cracked but intact. He pushed the door open. The pitch hall was large, much larger than he expected. The floor was smooth concrete painted in faded lines of a football pitch. The goals were metal frames with nets that had long since decayed, hanging in tatters. Windows high on the wall let in streaks of winter light. And on one wall, almost invisible beneath grime, a board of photos and newspaper clippings. He approached slowly, breath caught somewhere between his chest and throat. There were pictures of kids celebrating small victories, lifting makeshift trophies, muddy and smiling. A clipping about local volunteers coaching underprivileged children. A faded campaign poster for fundraising, "Help US Keep the Doors Open." At the bottom corner, nearly hidden, was a picture of Arthur. Not the one Eleanor had shown him. Not a posed photo. This one caught Arthur mid-laugh, head thrown back as a boy clung to him after scoring a goal. His arms wrapped around the child protectively, proudly, as though he were holding the world's greatest treasure. David touched the photograph lightly. "That's exactly how he was," a voice said from behind him. David spun around. A teenager stood near the door, maybe 17, lanky, wearing a worn-out coat and trainers with frayed laces. His hair was curly, his eyes bright but cautious. "Sorry," the boy said quickly. "Didn't mean to startle you. I just saw the door open. No one ever comes here." David softened. "It's all right. Do you know this place well?" The boy shrugged. "Used to. Before everything shut down. We still play out back sometimes when the security guards don't chase us off." He hesitated, then stepped closer. "You looking for someone?" "It's usually empty." David turned back to Arthur's picture. For a heartbeat, he wondered whether to lie, whether to shield the truth that still felt too fragile to show. But the boy's open expression disarmed him. "I'm looking for the man in this photo," David said quietly. "Arthur Walsh." The boy's eyes widened. "Mr. Walsh?" His voice cracked with genuine surprise. He was a legend around here. People still talk about him." David nodded slowly. "He meant a lot to many." The boy stepped closer to Arthur's photo, dropping his voice. "He helped my cousin. Got him boots when he couldn't afford them. Talked to him when he nearly joined the wrong crowd." A small smile tugged his lips. "Said every kid deserved a fair chance. Never met anyone like him." David's throat tightened. "Did you know him well?" he asked. "Not super well. I was small when the center started falling apart. But everyone knew him." The boy paused. "You look like you knew him." David hesitated. He swallowed the truth that still trembled. I'm someone who should have known him better. The boy nodded slowly as if accepting an answer he didn't fully understand. Then he smiled awkwardly. Do you want to see the back pitch? It's not much, but... David nodded gratefully. Yes, I'd like that. The boy led him through another corridor lined with peeling posters advertising kids' tournaments from years gone. They reached a rusted door that opened to a small courtyard behind the building. The back pitch was cracked asphalt, faded goal posts, weeds poking through lines that once marked boundaries. But there were voices, the unmistakable sound of children shouting, laughing. A group of young boys were kicking a flat, half-deflated ball. When they saw the visitor, they stopped. One of them nudged the other. That's David Beckham, one whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. David smiled gently. Just Dave is fine. The boys stared at him in stunned silence. The lanky teen broke the tension. It's all right. He's cool. Do you lads play here often? David asked. Only when we're not kicked out, a boy answered. Youth center shut years ago. No one fixed it. David glanced around. The crumbling walls, the sagging roofline, the broken windows patched with cardboard. And yet, children still came. Children still played. This place still mattered, even in ruins. Do you know who built this center? David asked. Mr. Walsh, several of them said at once. He coached me, brother, one boy said. He gave me gloves in winter, another added. He told us we weren't rubbish just because school said so. A small boy, 8 maybe 9, spoke last. He said football makes your heart louder. David froze. That sounded exactly like something Arthur would have written. I wish he was still here, the boy said softly. David nodded, staring at the cracked pitch that had once been alive with Arthur's voice. Me too, lad. More than you know. The boys resumed playing, emboldened now, showing off passes and shots as if they had something to prove. David watched them for a long time, long enough to see the echoes of his own childhood in every miskicked ball, every burst of laughter. Eventually the lanky teen nudged him gently. You okay? David nodded. I think this place tells a bigger story than I realized. The boy shoved his hands into his pockets. It still could, you know. If someone fixed it. People round here don't have much. Places like this, they matter. His voice cracked slightly on that last word. It wasn't just a casual comment. It was a plea. A hope. David inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of Arthur's notebook in his jacket pocket. This center, he said carefully, if it were restored, rebuilt properly, would people use it? The teen's eyes lit up. Use it? Mate, it'd be packed. People would queue. Kids need somewhere safe. Somewhere not the street. David nodded slowly. He already knew his answer. He had known it since the moment he stepped into the abandoned hall. But hearing it from the boy made it feel ordained. When the boys finished their game and drifted away, David wandered back inside alone. He walked the halls again, touching the walls gently as though reacquainting himself with something sacred. In a small office near the entrance, he found an old metal filing cabinet. Most drawers were empty, but the bottom one resisted when he tried to pull it open. After a few tugging attempts, it slid out with a screech. Inside were papers swollen from damp, attendance sheets, emergency contact forms, donation requests, and a notebook wrapped in plastic. He pulled it out carefully. It wasn't Arthur's handwriting, but it belonged to the center. Notes from a volunteer named Maxine Carter. He flipped through it. Arthur brought in spare sandwiches again. Says the lads play better when they're fed. Roof leaking in the hall. Arthur climbed up himself. Told him he's too damn old for that. Funding meetings failing. Arthur breaking. Trying not to show it. He came in early today. Sat in the hall alone. Stared at the pitch for ages. Said he wished he'd done more. Told him he had already done more than anyone else here ever had. David closed the notebook, chest tightening. Every step he took through the center felt like walking deeper into the chambers of Arthur's heart. He wandered until he reached a room at the far end, a storage room barely intact. Inside were shelves of flattened balls, old cones, broken whistles. In the corner stood a framed poster. Arthur's Unity League, bringing heart back to the game. And below it, written in marker. Never a bench. Always a place. David touched the frame. This was his cathedral, he whispered to himself. This was where he came to be part of something since he couldn't be part of us. He sank onto an old bench, exhaustion and emotion finally overtaking him. He pulled Arthur's notebook from his jacket and turned to the last entry. He hadn't read it before. His hands trembled as he opened the page. To the boy I love the most. I don't know if you will ever step foot in this place. But if you do, I want you to know it was built with the same love I would have given you. Every child I coached was a piece of the fatherhood I wasn't allowed to claim. If you are reading this, then the world has given us a strange gift, connection without time. I hope the place speaks to you. I hope you hear what I never said. And if you can, finish what I couldn't. Arthur. David leaned back, closing his eyes against the weight of the words. Finish what I couldn't. Finish what I couldn't. It echoed again and again until it no longer felt like a request. It felt like a mission, a calling, a responsibility carved straight out of love and loss. After a long time, he rose from the bench and walked out into the corridor. The building seemed less empty now, filled with ghosts, yes, but also filled with purpose. He stepped into the pitch hall one last time. Sunlight broke through the clouds outside, slipping through the dusty windows and landing in a single bright patch on the center circle. David walked into the circle and stood there, hands in his pockets, head bowed, feeling something warm rise inside him, something he had not felt since he was a boy chasing a ball across worn-out grass. Belonging. He whispered, barely audible. I'm here now, Arthur. I'm here. And for the first time since learning the truth, he felt like he wasn't alone. The night before the center's reopening, David Beckham lay awake in the dim glow of a single lamp. Arthur's notebook rested on the table beside him, open to the last page, the ink smudged as if even the pen had struggled to contain the weight of the man's final thoughts. He tried to close his eyes, but each time he did the page returned like an afterimage burned into his mind. Finish what I couldn't. Those 4 words followed him through every room of the quiet house, down every corridor of memory he didn't know he had. He wasn't sure if they were a plea, a blessing, or a goodbye. At dawn he drove back to Manchester, the city still half asleep beneath a pale sky. The closer he came to the Reston Center, the steadier his pulse grew, not from fear but from a strange sense of arrival. As if this journey was never optional, only delayed. The workers were already there when he arrived, unloading final equipment, checking the lights, brushing dust from the new paint. The smell of fresh timber mixed with the earthy morning chill. He stood for a long moment outside the building, its facade completely transformed, the shattered windows replaced, the walls repainted, the broken signage restored with brand new lettering. It looked alive again. When he stepped inside, footsteps echoed in the hall. The pitch gleamed under bright white lights. The once rotting floors now shone with a clean sheen, the kind that invited play, not caution. The old mural of children had been repainted, their faces bright, their smiles fierce and hopeful. He walked slowly across the pitch. Each step felt like a conversation with Arthur. He could almost imagine the man standing in the corner, hands in his pockets, nodding quietly in approval. Or perhaps fighting back tears. David didn't know which version of Arthur lived more truthfully, the man who had stood at a distance or the man who had filled diaries with love. Morning, Dave. Lewis stood in the doorway, hands deep in his pockets as always, but his face open, excited. You ready? The boy asked. David smiled. As ready as I'll ever be. People began to gather outside. Locals, families, former volunteers, officials from the council, even a handful of retired players who had coached charity matches for the center years ago. Children pressed their faces to the glass, eyes wide, whispering in awe at the man they had only seen on screens. But David wasn't thinking about them. He was thinking about the children Arthur had coached, the ones whose stories he had only just begun to understand. He was thinking about the father he'd never embraced, never heard laugh in person, never argued with, never thanked. As the time drew near, the noise outside rose into a warm, chaotic hum. It felt like a heartbeat. When he stepped out onto the small outdoor platform they'd hastily assembled, the murmur of the crowd fell into silence. He scanned the sea of faces, curious, hopeful, emotional, and felt a weight settle gently on his shoulders. Not burden. Not grief. Responsibility. I didn't prepare something formal, he began, his voice softer than he expected. I didn't want to. The truth echoed in the air. I'm here because of a man many of you knew. A man who worked in this community long before anyone ever put a camera in front of him. His name was Arthur Walsh. A ripple traveled through the crowd. Some nodded. Some whispered to one another. Some lowered their heads. He believed in this place, David continued. He believed in children who had no reason to believe in themselves. He coached them, fed them, protected them. He gave everything he had to this center. He paused, swallowing against the tightening in his throat. And recently I learned something I should have known my whole life. He felt Eleanor beside him. He could almost feel her urging him forward with her silence. Arthur wasn't just a good man to this community. He was my father. The reaction was immediate. Soft gasps, hands covering mouths, others murmuring in disbelief. David let the wave of emotion settle before speaking again. I didn't grow up with him. I didn't know his story. I didn't know how much he carried. But I've learned that love doesn't disappear just because it's hidden. Sometimes it grows stronger in the shadows. A tear rolled down Eleanor's cheek. Louis stared at him with wide, disbelieving eyes, as if seeing the man anew. This center, David said, looking back at the sign above the door, is not a tribute to him. It is a continuation of him. A man who gave so much deserves to have his work live on. And every child who walks through these doors deserves the same chance he tried to give. He stepped back, lifting the small plaque he had kept hidden until now. A soft gasp rose when he revealed Arthur's smiling face printed on polished metal. The same photo taken mid-laugh, holding a child after a victory. Below the picture, to the father who loved in silence, to the dream that refused to die. When the ribbon was cut, applause burst from the crowd, overflowing the street like a breaking wave. Children raced inside, their footsteps ringing against the new floors. Volunteers cried openly. Neighbors hugged each other without quite knowing why. Inside, the lights felt brighter than they had the day before. Laughter filled spaces that had echoed with emptiness for years. Coaches shook David's hand, thanking him not for his fame, but for his heart. Late in the afternoon, when the excitement softened into a calm hum, David slipped quietly into Arthur's old office. It looked different now. Fresh paint, organized shelves, a working computer, but somehow it still felt like Arthur's presence lived in the corners. On the desk lay a brand new notebook the staff had placed there for him. He sat down, smelling the faint mix of fresh paper and new beginnings. For a long time he didn't write anything. He just sat in the chair, feeling the weight of everything he had discovered, everything he had lost, everything he had finally found. Then, slowly he put pen to paper. I didn't know your voice, but I know your heart now. And I promise you, your dream didn't end in silence. I will carry it the way you carried me. He closed the notebook and stood. Before leaving, he placed Arthur's original whistle, found in the tin box, on the shelf beside the door. Not as a relic of the past, but as a symbol of the future. When he joined the children on the pitch outside, the sun was sinking low over Manchester, painting the sky in gold and rose. A small boy tugged at his sleeve, holding out a ball. Mr. Beckham, will you play with us? David bent down, smiling gently. I'd be honored. As the game started, wild, messy, joyful, he felt something shift inside him. Not the disappearance of grief, but its transformation. Arthur wasn't gone. Not really. He lived in every laugh, in every pass, in every child who sprinted after a dream without knowing that a man they would never meet had once built a place for them to belong. In the fading light, with the sounds of children running, shouting, celebrating, David looked towards the office window, half expecting to see a figure standing there. And maybe in some way he did. He whispered under his breath, "You can rest now, Dad. I'm here."